Great to be joined from Canberra by the National Party leader, David Littleproud. David, you and I, in your former capacity as Agriculture Minister and now as the Shadow, we've talked a lot about biosecurity. Are we seeing a cut in funding in the May budget under Jim Chalmers?
Well, it looks as though they're pre-positioning themselves to try and cut and run. They're trying to be dodgy with the numbers and try and create an excuse that apparently it was all our fault, despite the fact that we left in June last year a net profit of the Department of Agriculture and Water Environment of an $88.4 million net profit. And now they're saying there's a couple of $100 million black hole. It takes a certain sort of talent that only Labor and Murray Watt and Anthony Albanese can achieve in actually turning a profit into a black hole. And I'll tell you how they've done it. They've done it by splitting ag and environment. And what they did was, when they did that, in the machinery of government changes, which is how the departments operate, is they put the resources in the environment and they put all the cost of the split onto agriculture. And so agriculture is paying the bill for environment. And what comes out the bottom of that is that biosecurity programs that are scheduled to go on now are potentially going to go unfunded. Now, Murray Watt seems to say, oh, no, it was all our fault. We had this drop-off. Well, Murray Watt only has to look at the budget papers, the budget that they had in October. And if it was a problem in October, he would have fixed it in October. But it wasn't a problem in October because the forwards, so budgets go across 4 years, they matched our forwards. So Murray's being tricky here. Something doesn't add up, but it adds up when you look underneath the bonnet that all they've done is foot the bill, Ag's footed the bill for environment so that they can go on their merry way. And now we're putting at risk programs such as biosecurity that are pivotal, not just for agriculture, but they're pivotal for the environment, which is just insane.
Well, when you look at the scale of what you're picking up in terms of preparations for the budget, what are we looking at in the Ag department in terms of its overall budget cut, or is it within the biosecurity area alone?
Well, there shouldn't be any cuts to the biosecurity because all the programs were funded. We put over $1 billion in the last two budgets into biosecurity and trade. So they are all into individual programs, and that was into new technology to make sure that we can increase our capacity. So that this money was all funded and budgeted for. And now for them to say, no, they're not. And they're now actually claiming yesterday that there's going to be a 25% drop in biosecurity funding over the next couple of years. We're going, where? How can that happen when your budget in October mirrored ours only about 7 months before on the forwards for the 4 years? Something's gone wrong, and you're being tricky with the numbers. Murray Watt is not being honest with Australian farmers, and this is what will happen, is that all these programs were funded and funded out over the forwards, and for some reason now they're not. And I think that comes down to priority, but it comes down to paying the bill effectively, or splitting agriculture and environment and departments, because that was a philosophical bent of the government. And those costs had to be borne, and those costs were borne by the Agriculture Department.
Now, David Littleproud is the Shadow Agriculture Minister. You'd told us around about March last year, just before the change of government in May, you had a process underway to consult on the new method of funding biosecurity. There was talk about maybe a levy on containers as they came into the country. Only you noticed on the 27th of March that the department started its consultation online about that. Has Labor held up that consultation for a new funding model?
Well, this is the other big kicker in this. This is where I'd said in train the last piece of consultation to move to a cost recovery model. Those who bore the greatest risk to our ag sector in bringing, whether it be container or bulk goods in, they paid commensurate to their risk and how many resources we had to put to it to manage that risk. Now, what's happened was that was meant to be complete so that at the end of last year, I could have introduced the income measure to bring that cost recovery measure. I had in the budget, in our March budget, the approval from Cabinet to bring in the only income measure into that budget, which was to have a cost recovery model for biosecurity, and I was to bring that back for implementation in the MyEFO at the end of last year. Now, Murray Watt hasn't been able to manage it, hasn't got control of his department. That seems to continue to be lingering on. And no wonder he's got a black hole in his budget as well, is because he hasn't moved to a cost recovery model. We actually supported industry with $71 million to allow transition over into a cost recovery model to freeze any increased costs that had to be borne. But obviously they've lost control of this, they've lost control of the process. But what that means is that you don't get the funding that's required to manage the risks that are there at the border. So Murray White has been asleep at the wheel, a nice bloke, but a lawyer from the Gold Coast that doesn't understand agriculture can be a big risk to agriculture if they're not over their job.
And speaking of those risks, I think recently in Melbourne there was a bit of panic over a cane toad that found its way in from Southeast Asia in someone's baggage. I know there's been a lot of concern expressed in the environmental area about myrtle rust. I mean, these are examples you're pointing out that it's not just agriculture, it is the environment that could actually suffer if we don't adequately fund biosecurity measures.
And that's right. But this is where the investment that we made, the $1 billion, was funded through the budget. It was all paid for. So, and it was in our forwards, and it was about new technology. So we're actually now trialling with New Zealand at Auckland Airport, where we're going to put in place a 3D X-ray scanner that your bag will go through. So we'll know what's in your bag before you even leave New Zealand and land here. And if we can prove that up, we'll put it into other ports. Every one of the 144 million parcels that go through Australia Post go through a 3D X-ray scanner. And with artificial intelligence that picks up organic and plant matter. That's the sort of technology that we invested in. And I'm confident that if this government continues to invest in that technology and the boots in the ground that we invested in, then you're going to actually be able to protect the Australian borders. But if you're prioritising environment and their specific programs rather than these programs, then ultimately you can't fund them, and that's the risk, and that's what Murray Watt has gone down a path of, because he doesn't carry the weight in Cabinet that obviously Tanya Plibersek does.
Well, David Littleproud is our Shadow Agriculture Minister at the federal level, and plenty to pursue leading up to the May budget. Thanks so much for joining us today on Flow.
Thanks for having me, mate.